Philip Barton Key was just 20 years old when the Revolutionary War broke out, and he was able to join the local militia as an officer to fight in the war. And he joined a Loyalist battalion in Maryland. I know, why are we talking about a Loyalist on Founder of the Day? Well, we'll get to that because Philip Barton Key, as it says next to me, is one of the few Loyalist soldiers who can be considered a founder of the United States. So I want to remind you that most of the revolutionaries, basically all the revolutionaries, were fighting for what they considered their rights as Englishmen. Most people in British North America considered Great Britain the most free country in the world. It's one of the reasons they were so upset when their freedoms, as they perceived them, were being taken away. Philip Barton Key thought his rights as an Englishman were being protected because he was an Englishman, and he wanted it to stay that way. So the war breaks out, and as I've said many times, the American Revolution was itself a civil war. It was very much family versus family, because Philip Barton Key not directly fought on the opposite side of his siblings, but actually chose a different side than his siblings. He fought for a while in the war, as I said, as a captain, an officer in the Maryland Loyalist militia. And he's actually captured in Florida and held as a prisoner for several years by the Spanish, who, of course, helped join the fight with the United States. Now, he had served for a good portion of the war, and it was shortly thereafter that the Battle of Yorktown occurred. Philip Barton Key then is exchanged with a large segment of British prisoners, and he then sails to New York City before evacuating to London. And he lives in England for almost a decade, but he studies law, he becomes a lawyer. But I said a decade, I meant 3 years. He's in London for 3 years, learns to be a lawyer, and then decides to quietly return to the United States. And he does. He returns to Maryland. And, it's a little awkward, but he's welcomed back by his brother John Ross Key, who had fought in the war on the side of the revolutionaries. So even though they fought a war against each other, literally, the brothers their old wounds are mended. They become friends again. Now, Philip Barton Key had lost all his property, as many Loyalists did, though he was just a young man at 20 years old when he first left, so he really didn't lose that much, but he needs to establish himself basically as a new man, and he does this. And after about a decade, and that's why I said a decade before, he's home for a decade when his transgressions are overlooked, and he's finally becomes a founder, because he's elected, despite having been a Loyalist, to Maryland's House of Delegates, their General Assembly. He also, after 5 years there, becomes mayor of Annapolis for 2 terms. Now, by 1801, he's obviously made good with his country because President John Adams comes knocking, and John Adams asks him to be a federal judge. He's actually one of the midnight judges that John Adams packed the courts with just before Thomas Jefferson stepped in to become president in his stead. Philip Barton Key only holds this position for about a year because when Jefferson gets into office, they overhaul the judicial system and get rid of a bunch of John Adams's appointees. And what's very interesting is the title he had. Philip Barton Key's title as a judge was Chief Judge of the United States Circuit Court for the Fourth Circuit. Now, when Jefferson comes in, they do a new Judiciary Act, and not only do they rearrange things and eliminate some jobs, but they change the titles also. This would basically be what we consider today the District of Maryland, or now, I believe today Maryland's actually broken up into several districts. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure about every judicial county in the United States right now. I am sure that Philip Barton Key is the only person to ever hold the lengthy title of Chief Judge of the United States Circuit Court for the Fourth Circuit. I have to read it. I can't even memorize it. Now, what's even more interesting about this is a few years later, there's the impeachment of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase, who himself, decades earlier, had signed the Declaration of Independence. And Philip Barton Key becomes one of several people to serve as a defense attorney and successfully prevent the impeachment of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. After this, Philip Barton Key, a Loyalist who fought with the British, may I remind you, was elected to the United States House of Representatives and would serve 6 years in Congress. before finally resigning and returning to private life as, at this point, we've passed some decades, a much older gentleman. And I want to point something out, that if the name Philip Barton Key seems familiar to you, it's probably the key. It's because he had a nephew whose name was Francis Scott Key, who is very famous for writing the Star-Spangled Banner just about 2 years after Philip leaves the United States House of Representatives. So that's a sweet tie in there for you. Again, a huge part of the American, well, I won't say huge, Philip Barton Key, a small part of the American founding, one of the few very loyalists who can be considered an American founder. I should also note that Francis Scott Key, his nephew, he has a descendant named F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. F. Scott, if I'm not mistaken, is Francis Scott Fitzgerald, as in Francis Scott Key, as in Philip Barton Key's nephew. So, hope you learned a little about this loyalist turned founder.